The rotors sliced through the humid morning air as a lone UH-1 Huey skimmed just above the treetops of South Vietnam. Bullets reached up from the jungle canopy, tracers cutting across the sky as if the forest itself had come alive. Most pilots would have broken away. Most would have looked for another landing zone, but this pilot pushed the helicopter lower, flying directly into the storm. On board were wounded soldiers whose survival depended on seconds. In Vietnam, courage often meant doing the impossible. Few men embodied that more than helicopter pilot Ace Cozzalio. The Vietnam War transformed the helicopter from a supporting aircraft into the centerpiece of modern warfare. Before Vietnam, helicopters were mainly used for transport and rescue. In Southeast Asia, they became everything at once: ambulances, troop carriers, gunships, command posts, and lifelines. They carried soldiers into battle, extracted the wounded, delivered supplies, and often became the only connection between isolated units and the outside world. Flying these missions demanded extraordinary skill. Dense jungle concealed enemy positions. Landing zones were often no larger than a clearing hacked from thick vegetation. Pilots flew through monsoon rains, mountain fog, intense heat, and relentless enemy fire. Every approach to a landing zone could become an ambush with little warning. Among the thousands of helicopter pilots who served, one name became synonymous with fearless determination: Ace Cozzalio. Fellow aviators remembered him as a pilot who never hesitated when lives were on the line. If soldiers were trapped, he volunteered. If another crew refused because the risk was too great, he considered how to make the mission work instead. Cozzalio understood the danger better than anyone. The Huey offered remarkable mobility, but it also made an inviting target. During low-level flights, enemy machine guns and rifles could strike the cockpit, engine, rotor system, or fuel tanks within seconds. Even a successful landing often meant hovering just long enough for the enemy to concentrate fire. Yet those risks never seemed to outweigh his sense of duty. Crew members later described missions where the helicopter absorbed damage, while Cozzalio remained calm on the controls, talking to his crew in a steady voice and focusing only on completing the mission. That composure inspired confidence. Soldiers climbing aboard believed that if Ace was flying, they had a real chance of making it home. The demands on helicopter crews were relentless. A single day might include inserting infantry before dawn, evacuating casualties at midday, delivering ammunition in the afternoon, and flying emergency extractions after sunset. Fatigue became a constant companion. Pilots often flew dozens of missions every week, each one carrying the possibility that it could be their last. As the war intensified, enemy forces adapted. Landing zones were carefully watched. Heavy machine guns were positioned along likely flight paths. Anti-aircraft fire became increasingly coordinated. Helicopter crews could no longer rely on speed alone. Every mission required careful planning, split-second decision-making, and absolute trust among the pilot, crew chief, and door gunners. For Ace Cozzalio, these growing dangers only reinforced the importance of the mission. Every successful evacuation meant another family would see their son again. Every delivery of ammunition could keep an isolated platoon alive until reinforcements arrived. The helicopter was far more than a machine. It represented hope arriving from the sky. That belief would soon be tested during some of the most dangerous rescue missions of the Vietnam War, where extraordinary courage would push both pilot and aircraft beyond what anyone thought possible. The mission that cemented Ace Cozzalio's reputation began like many others with a desperate radio call. American and South Vietnamese troops had become pinned down deep inside hostile territory. Enemy fire surrounded their position, and casualties were mounting. The only hope for many of the wounded was immediate helicopter evacuation. Every minute that passed reduced their chances of survival. The weather offered little help. Heat shimmered over the jungle canopy, while smoke from artillery strikes drifted across the valleys, making visibility unpredictable. Intelligence reports warned that North Vietnamese forces had positioned heavy machine guns around the landing zone, anticipating exactly this kind of rescue attempt. More than one crew had already turned back after encountering intense fire. Ace Cozzalio volunteered anyway. His UH-1 Huey lifted into the air with its familiar roar, carrying a crew that fully understood what lay ahead. No one spoke much. They had flown together long enough to know that once they crossed into the combat zone, every second would demand complete concentration. As they approached the extraction site, the radio came alive with frantic voices. Soldiers on the ground described wounded men lying exposed, unable to move because enemy fire swept across the clearing. Smoke grenades marked the landing zone, but they also revealed its location to every enemy gunner nearby. Then the shooting began. Bright streams of tracer rounds climbed toward the helicopter from multiple directions. Bullets cracked through the air, punching holes in the Huey's skin. Warning lights flickered across the instrument panel as rounds struck the aircraft. The crew chief shouted damage reports while the door gunners fired back, trying to suppress enemy positions hidden among the trees. Most pilots would have aborted the landing. Ace kept descending. He guided the Huey into the tiny clearing with remarkable precision, holding the aircraft steady despite explosions erupting only meters away. Dust, leaves, and smoke exploded beneath the spinning rotor blades, creating a blinding cloud that made it difficult to see anything outside the cockpit. Medic teams rushed toward the helicopter, carrying wounded soldiers. Some could walk with assistance, others had to be dragged or lifted aboard under continuous enemy fire. Every extra second on the ground increased the danger, yet Ace refused to lift off until every available casualty had been loaded. The Huey struggled as it climbed away, heavier than planned and taking fire from nearly every side. Several rounds struck the fuselage again. One passed through the cabin, narrowly missing crew members before exiting the opposite side. Another damaged critical components, threatening the helicopter's ability to remain airborne. Despite the damage, Ace maintained complete control. Rather than climbing sharply, which would expose the helicopter even longer, he flew low over the jungle, weaving between hills and tree lines to reduce the enemy's firing angles. His experience allowed him to anticipate terrain features that concealed the aircraft while keeping enough speed to outrun pursuing fire. Back at the medical facility, surgeons were already waiting. As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad, medics immediately began unloading the wounded. Several of those soldiers would later survive because they reached surgical care in time. For them, the difference between life and death had been measured not in hours, but in minutes, and in the willingness of one pilot to fly where others believed no helicopter could safely go. That mission was not unique. Again and again, Ace Cozzalio answered similar calls. Whether delivering ammunition to surrounded units, extracting wounded infantry, or inserting troops into contested landing zones, he consistently placed the mission and the lives of others ahead of his own safety. His fellow pilots began to view him as someone who never allowed fear to dictate his decisions. The risks continued to escalate as the war intensified. Enemy forces became increasingly skilled at creating deadly anti-aircraft traps, forcing helicopter crews into ever more dangerous approaches. Yet each successful rescue strengthened the confidence of soldiers on the ground. Hearing that Ace Cozzalio was coming often meant hope had arrived, even before the helicopter appeared over the trees. That reputation would ultimately lead him into the most dangerous mission of his career, one that would forever define his legacy among Vietnam's helicopter pilots. The mission that would forever define Ace Cozzalio's legacy came during one of the most dangerous rescue operations of the war. Friendly troops had become trapped under intense enemy fire, and several helicopters attempting to reach them had already been driven back or damaged. The landing zone had become a killing ground. Every pilot understood the odds. Ace understood them too. Yet when the call came asking for volunteers, he didn't hesitate. His Huey crossed the tree line at low altitude, hugging the terrain to reduce exposure. The crew could already hear rounds striking the jungle around them before the landing zone came into view. Thick smoke drifted across the clearing, mixing with dust and burning vegetation. Somewhere below, wounded soldiers waited, hoping another helicopter hadn't decided the risk was too great. As Ace brought the aircraft into its descent, enemy machine guns erupted from concealed positions. Tracer rounds tore through the air from multiple directions, converging on the helicopter. Warning lights flashed again inside the cockpit. The aircraft shuddered as bullets ripped through its fuselage. Still, he continued. The Huey touched down just long enough for soldiers to rush aboard. Crew members pulled wounded men inside, while door gunners fired relentlessly into the surrounding tree line. Every second felt impossibly long. Then another burst of enemy fire struck the helicopter. Critical systems were damaged, and the aircraft began losing performance almost immediately. Despite the worsening situation, Ace managed to lift the overloaded helicopter off the ground, refusing to leave behind those who had already boarded. With remarkable control, he kept the crippled aircraft flying long enough to give his passengers a chance to survive. His actions reflected a pattern that had defined his entire service. Again and again, he chose responsibility over personal safety. To him, flying wasn't about heroics or recognition, it was about bringing people home. Stories like his spread quickly through aviation units. Younger pilots studied the decisions made by experienced men like Ace, learning that courage wasn't reckless aggression. It was discipline under unimaginable pressure. It meant making impossible decisions while remaining calm enough to fly the aircraft, communicate with the crew, monitor instruments, and protect the people depending on you. The Vietnam War became known as the Helicopter War because no previous conflict had relied so heavily on rotary wing aviation. More than 12,000 helicopters served during the conflict, and thousands were lost in combat or accidents. Countless pilots never returned. Every mission demanded extraordinary skill, yet history often remembers only the larger battles and political decisions. Behind those headlines were individual stories like Ace Cozzalio's, stories of pilots who repeatedly flew into places others were desperately trying to escape, stories of crews who landed in tiny jungle clearings surrounded by enemy fire because wounded strangers were waiting, stories of ordinary men who performed extraordinary acts, not because they expected fame, but because they believed no one should be left behind. Ace Cozzalio earned lasting respect, not only for his flying ability, but for the unwavering commitment he showed to the soldiers on the ground. Among those who served with him, his name became associated with determination, professionalism, and a willingness to accept incredible risks when lives were at stake. Today, decades after the Vietnam War ended, the sound of Huey rotor blades remains one of the conflict's most recognizable symbols. For veterans, it represents fear, relief, survival, and sacrifice all at once. And for many, it also recalls pilots like Ace Cozzalio, men who flew into overwhelming danger so others could live. History is filled with famous generals and celebrated battles. But sometimes the greatest stories belong to the individuals whose names are less widely known, whose courage unfolded a few hundred feet above the jungle canopy, one rescue mission at a time. Ace Cozzalio's legacy is not measured simply by the hours he flew or the medals he earned. It lives in the soldiers who survived because a helicopter appeared when hope seemed lost. It lives in the pilots who followed his example. And it endures as a reminder that in war, the most extraordinary acts are often performed by people who simply refuse to abandon those counting on them. Long after the gunfire faded over Vietnam, the legend of pilots like Ace Cozzalio continued to fly.